Okay, so spinal cord. The spinal cord is basically the connecting organ between your brain and the rest of your body. Okay, so it's a highway, and it's what we refer to as a bidirectional highway. You got information going up to the brain, you got information coming down from the brain. All right, so this is important. I told my other section this, and I'm going to tell you this. Right, any pathway, right, any group of nerves that are traveling from the body up to the brain are called ascending pathways. Okay? Ascending pathways are sensory pathways. They bring sensory information from the body up to the brain. Okay? Then we have descending pathways. These are pathways, right, that are leaving the brain and going out to the body. Those are descending pathways. So those are always motor. Okay? Make a note of that. I don't want you, usually that appears on a test question. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of these common pathways. We're going to talk about the motor pathway that leaves, right, your brain. We're going to talk about some of the sensory pathways that come up from your body up to the brain. Right, so we're going to go over a couple of those. Right, we're going to start off with the sensory, and then we'll hit some, if we have time, we'll hit some motor pathways. All right, so I want to talk about some of the characteristics that these pathways share. First is they're paired. That means you have one on the left and you got one on the right. Okay, so because remember, you have these pathways will cross from one side of the body to the other. Okay, so we can't just have one pathway. We got to have one for each side of your body. Right. Second, the cell location. This is very, very important. Okay? When I talk about these pathways or these tracts, remember the definition of a tract? Tract is a myelinated axon. Actually, I should be more specific. It's a bundle of myelinated axons in the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. Okay? So that's when we're talking about these spinal cord tracts. We're talking about myelinated axons. Okay? Now, when we get to the peripheral nervous system, it's just same thing. What do we call a bundle of myelinated axons in the peripheral nervous system? What's that term? If I got shooting pain that goes down my leg. Sciatica. What is sciatica referring to? Sciatic nerve, nerves. Okay, so bundles of myelinated axons in the peripheral nervous system are nerves. Bundles of myelinated axons in the central nervous system are tracts. You got to try to pronounce that T, tracts. Okay, so now that's only one part of the cell. Okay, you can't forget the cell bodies, the dendrites. Okay, so the cell bodies, okay, are in the ganglia. So ganglia in the peripheral nervous system is a cluster of cell bodies. You know that definition. A ganglia in the peripheral nervous system, right, are called a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called the ganglia. A cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called nucleus. Okay? All right, so that's ganglia. Also, when we're talking about the cell locations, spinal cord gray horns. Here's your spinal cord. This is going to be a very horrible picture. Okay, you got this letter H kind of structure in the middle of it. Oh, this is awful. I'm embarrassed. There's a little hole in the middle. Okay, all this that I'm shading in is gray matter. And then the parts that I didn't shade in is white matter. Okay? So when we talk about the gray horns, we're referring to the gray matter here. Okay? This is the posterior horn, this is the anterior horn, then you got one here on the side. I didn't do a very good job. It's called the lateral horn. We'll get into all that. Okay? But it's just gray matter. Okay? And then finally, the cerebral cortex or any of the brain gray matter. Okay? So that's all for the cell locations there. Right? So these pathways that we're going to be talking about, these sensory motor pathways that we're going to be talking about, are made up of a minimum of 2 neurons. Normally, it's 2 to 3. Okay, so we say 2 or more because there's in some situations you do have 4. It has to be a minimum of 2. Okay, so 2 or more neurons, right, are going to be found in these pathways here. Now, in case you're not sure what this term here means, decussate, that means to cross over. Okay, so most of these pathways are going to cross the midline of your body. Well, that makes sense, right? Because the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body and vice versa, right? They have to cross over. Okay, so when they cross over to the opposite side, we call that the contralateral side. Now, some don't cross. Okay? They stay on the same side, then we refer to that as an ipsilateral side of the body. Okay? There's some that don't cross. Okay? So remember when we were talking about the midbrain, you had the pyramids there. Did I say the midbrain? Excuse me. When we were talking about the medulla oblongata, you had the pyramids, and those are structures on the anterior portion of the medulla oblongata. And those are motor tracts. Specifically, right, pyramidal tracts, which have to do with voluntary motor tracts, which means those voluntary motor tracts innervate skeletal muscle. Right? Well, they cross over, right, and that they decussate. I have to be careful how I say it because there's decussate and there's desiccate, 2 different terms. Right? They sound similar. Decussate is crossing over. Decussate is degeneration, drying up, like your discs. Intervertebral discs in your spine as you get older, right, they dry up. Remember that jelly, that nucleus pulposus that's in the middle of the disc, all right? It's like a jelly donut. Everybody here, for the most part, has that. Right? But when you get into your 60s and 70s, it dries up. That's called decussation. Okay, so we're going to talk about the sensory pathways first. Okay? Like I said, think of the spinal cord as a bidirectional highway that's going to carry information up to the brain and down from the brain. Okay? So when we're talking about sensory input, this goes back to chapter 1. All right? Receptor, control center, effector. Okay? So we're going to talk about the receptor to the control center. Okay? We're going to talk about the first part of that homeostasis scenario. So how that sensory input, right, that was generated, right, somewhere in the periphery is going to enter into your brain. Okay? So it's got to go from the periphery somewhere, foot, hand, eye, whatever, all right, up to the brain, okay? So it's going to travel through the spinal cord. It's going to come from what we call the general sense receptors. Think of your 5 senses: touch, taste, sight, sound, okay, hearing, okay, all of that. So we're going to divide those into 2 categories. All right, now remember, somatic, anytime you see somatic, think of either voluntary, if it's muscle, okay, or conscious perception. Okay, so somatic sensory receptors are going to be these sense receptors that we consciously perceive what's going on. Touch, all right, vibration, light touch, deep touch, pain, all right. This term here, proprioception, all right. It's very important that you understand this proprioception. And I never can tell if people understand what proprioception is because I talk about it on and off throughout the semester. Okay? But basically, proprioception, right, or proprioceptors are going to detect the stretch in your joints, your muscles, and the tendons. Okay? So they basically, what proprioception is your body's sensory awareness or spatial awareness of itself in relation to itself. Right? So what does that mean? Right? If I were to close my eyes, and if someone was to come up behind me and just gently lift my arm up to the side here, away from my body, right, those proprioceptors that are in my glenohumeral joint are going to be blasting my brain with information saying, hey, your arm is abducting. My eyes are closed. I can't see it. So I'm taking my visual senses out of that. But all these proprioceptors are shooting up into my brain to let me know that my arm is being lifted up. Okay? Because the muscles there are getting stretched, right? We're getting positional changes in the tendons there and the joint capsules there, okay? Tactile receptors we're familiar with, okay? Touching stuff, what it feels like. So the other type of category is visceral sensory receptors. Right, now this is the stuff that's we can't consciously perceive. Right? So this has to do with, now remember, visceral has to do with viscera, and viscera are going to be organs. Okay? So this has to do with any type of change in our organs. And the one that's easiest to describe are stretch receptors. Your stomach has stretch receptors inside. Okay, so when you eat a big meal, your stomach stretches out, and then it stimulates the vagus nerve to stimulate your hypothalamus to shut it down. Like you're going to get that sensation of being full. Okay, and that's due to the stretch receptors being stimulated. But I can't tell. All right, now I can tell that my stomach is probably full because I'm not hungry anymore. But I might feel bloated because it's actually pushing, all right, on some of the other tissues in the area, which is activating tactile receptors. But I can't tell that my stomach stretches a millimeter. Can't tell that. Your brain can, right, through the visceral sensory receptors. All right, so let's jump into, all right, two of the sensory pathways here. All right, we got our somatosensory. Okay, so this is basically going to carry information from the skin, your muscles, and your joints. We'll have conscious perception of that, because most of your sensory receptors are located in your skin. Okay, remember the Pacinian corpuscles and the Meissner's corpuscles? Those are the touch receptors. They also have to do with vibration. Okay, so those are going to be, that information is going to travel on the somatosensory pathway. Then, of course, we have our visceral sensory pathways. And that's going to carry information from our organs, the viscera. Okay? So in these pathways, we have three neurons, the series of neurons. There's three of them. Okay? So there's first order, second order, or third order, or I like to call them primary, secondary, and tertiary. Okay? So the primary neuron, that's the first one. Okay? It's going to be found out in the periphery. So we'll use the skin as an example. All right? The receptor will be found in the skin, or we refer to that as the peripheral ending. Okay? And then the cell body for this neuron is going to be found in our posterior root ganglion. Now, these primary neurons, all right, are what we call, this goes back to when we were lab, when I briefly went over the different types of neurons, bipolar, multipolar, axonic, right? A bipolar neuron is one where the cell body sits here, and then it has one process that comes off that splits. One process goes one way, the other process goes the other way. This one process is going to be the dendrite. It's going to be a specialized dendrite that has these nerve endings at the end. Then this guy, so this will be the, I'll put D over here, and this guy over here is the axon. So this axon is going to travel all the way down and then synapse onto another neuron. Okay? So this is called a bipolar neuron. The cell body is going to be found, and you need to know this, the posterior root ganglion. This is the cell body or the soma. Okay? Then the axon is going to head towards the secondary neuron. That'll be somewhere in, well, I won't say where it's going to be because it varies depending on which pathway we're talking about. Okay? So then the primary neuron is going to synapse onto a secondary neuron. Well, that secondary neuron is an interneuron. Okay? So it's going to receive that information from the primary neuron, and it's going to take that information up to either the cerebellum, okay, especially if it has to do with proprioceptive information, okay, or it's going to take that information up to a tertiary neuron, the third neuron there. Usually that's found in the thalamus, okay? Then finally, the tertiary neuron is going to transmit that information to the somatosensory cortex. And where's that located? Parietal lobe. Remember our parietal. And this can be somewhat confusing. I'm going to go through this with you guys, okay? I'm going to go through this with you. I'll show you a quick example, and then I'll come back. But I just kind of want you to have a general idea. Right, when we're talking about these sensory pathways, we have three neurons, okay? A primary, secondary, and a tertiary. At least this for today. know this. The primary neuron, all right, is found out in the periphery, okay? Out in your skin, for example, the tip of your finger, okay? It's going to run all the entire length of your arm up to your spinal cord, okay? That's long. That's one cell. Neurons are long, okay? At least get that for today, all right? I want you to get everything, but we'll go with that. So that's what this picture is showing us here. I'm going to zoom in here, all right? So this neuron goes out here. I'm going to try. It's the Simpsons. I'm only going to give them 4 fingers, okay? So that primary neuron goes all the way out here to the tip of the finger, okay? So say you're touching something pointy, okay? That's going to stimulate that primary neuron, and it's going to send sensory information all the way down the entire length of the neuron here, all right? Here's the cell body. Cell body's here in the posterior root ganglion. We'll talk about that in lab, all right? That information, that then the axon is going to enter into the spinal cord, and it's going to ascend. It's going to travel up to the brainstem, specifically the medulla oblongata. We'll go through this. And then it's going to synapse onto a second neuron, okay? And that second neuron is going to travel up to, in most cases, to the thalamus, where it's going to synapse onto what we call the tertiary neuron. Then that tertiary neuron is going to go up to the cerebral cortex somewhere, okay? Just in general. Now, I'm going to get specific here in a second. In fact, I'm going to get specific here with this pathway. Okay, let's do the first of the named sensory pathways. Okay, this is called the medial lemniscal pathway or the posterior funiculus, either or. Right, now I briefly mentioned the medial lemniscal, the medial lemniscus when we were talking about the midbrain. Okay, and the medial lemniscus contains sensory or ascending myelinated axons. That's all it is. So it's going to be white matter. Okay? All right. So first, what you need to know for the medial lemniscal pathway is the type of information that it carries. Make sure you know this. Proprioception, touch. That includes light, touch. Right? Pressure and vibration. Okay? So you need to know, because you'll be asked that, possibly, right, that the medial lemniscal pathway carries proprioception, touch, pressure, and vibration. It's going to use that 3-neuron chain that I just went over, okay? Okay, so let's start off. I'm going to go neuron by neuron. I'm going to do one neuron, take you to the picture, show you the pathway, which I kind of did just a moment ago. Then I'll go to the next neuron, okay? So the primary neuron, that's going to go from the skin to the brainstem, right? So quickly here. Right, that's what we saw here. That's the one I drew that finger. It's going to come from the skin. Right, it's going to enter into the spinal cord here. Okay, specifically with my bad drawing here of the spinal cord. Remember when I drew that H there and everything? Okay. All right, all this is gray matter here that I'm filling in. Right, these areas that are left over of white matter here, 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 and here. This area back here is referred to as the posterior funiculus. Okay? The posterior funiculus. That's just white matter. That's what we call this region of white matter in the posterior region of the spinal cord. Okay? Now, in the posterior funiculus, we divide those two regions, not the two regions, we divide the posterior funiculus up into 2 regions, okay? We have the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus, okay? And you can see those right here, okay? So the fasciculus gracilis is going to carry information, that sensory information that I just talked about, from the lower half of your body. Easy way to remember that. Where's the gracilis muscle? In your leg. Okay? That's how I remembered it. Okay? So in the direct center is going to be your right and left fasciculus gracilis. And then on either side of that, which sandwiches the fasciculus gracilis, that's going to be the fasciculus cuneatus. The fasciculus cuneatus is going to carry that sensory information from the upper half of your body. Okay? But all of that together in that white matter there is called the posterior funiculus. Okay, so you can see now, all right, that primary neuron enters into the spinal cord, all right, and then it ascends up to the midbrain here. Excuse me, I keep saying the midbrain, all right, to the medulla oblongata. It depends on which fasciculus that it's going into, all right. If it's the fasciculus gracilis, then it's going to synapse in the nucleus gracilis. If it travels up in the fasciculus cuneatus, that pathway there, then it's going to synapse in the nucleus cuneatus, okay? Whatever fasciculus it travels up is going to be where it's going to synapse, right, up into the midbrain there. All right. So that's what this is saying over here, okay? So that peripheral receptor is going to travel into the spinal cord, all right, through the spinal nerve. It's going to enter into the posterior root, that's the back portion of the spinal cord, all right, enter into the spinal cord, and then it's going to enter into either the fasciculus cuneatus or the fasciculus gracilis. And it's going to ascend up to the medulla oblongata, where it's going to synapse with the secondary neuron, okay? So in the secondary neuron here, right, the secondary neuron is easy. It's going to go, right, from the medulla all the way up to the thalamus, okay? So before it goes up to the thalamus, it first has to cross over, okay? So when it crosses over to the other side, it enters into the medial lemniscus. It's going to travel all the way up in the medial lemniscus until it synapses in the thalamus on the tertiary neuron. I'll show you. Okay. All right, so here's our primary neuron. It's synapsing onto our secondary neuron in either the nucleus gracilis or the nucleus cuneatus. All right. Then that secondary neuron is going to cross over, right? So it's going to decussate. It's going to cross over into, right, our medial lemniscus. And then it's going to travel all the way up. It's going to go up through the pons. It's going to go up through the midbrain, traveling in the medial lemniscus all the way up to the thalamus. So after it decussates, right, now it's going to travel in the medial lemniscus all the way up to the thalamus. Okay? Then it synapses onto the tertiary neuron. Okay? Now at the tertiary neuron, it's only got one place to go. The primary somatosensory cortex, which is in the parietal lobe. That's an easy one. The other ones are a little more complicated. All right, so that tertiary neuron, that third neuron, is going to head to our primary somatosensory cortex. So you actually get a sense, you feel whatever the sensation is. If it's a vibration, it's a light touch, deep touch, regardless. Right? When it gets to the thalamus and it transmits up there to the primary somatosensory cortex, that's when you actually have the conscious perception that something touched your finger. Okay? So all that has to happen, all right, for you to have the realization that something's touching your finger. All right, that's the medial lemniscal pathway. Let's do another sensory pathway. All right, this one is called the anterior lateral pathway. So hence, all right, it's going to travel, right, either on the anterior or lateral portion of the spinal cord. Okay? We'll talk about that. Same type of scenario, but first let me just mention this. Okay? Sensations, you need to know this. Crude touch, crude unrefined touch. Again, pressure. Pain, that's a big one. Okay? And then temperature. Okay? It's also going to utilize a 3-neuron chain. So we're going to go through those 3 neurons once again. Okay? So the first neuron, again, all the primary neurons all share a similar origin. They're going to originate out in the periphery somewhere, right? In the skin somewhere, okay? So the same type of scenario is going to occur. It's going to originate out in the skin. The neuron's going to we'll use the same example. That same finger goes to touch something. In this case, right, we'll say it's hot. And so it's causing, you're getting the sensation of the hot temperature and the painful stimulus of that. So that information is going to travel up that neuron, right, and it's going to go all the way into the spinal cord. So it enters the spinal cord through the spinal nerve, and it goes through the posterior root. Now, just to kind of review that, and again, we're going to talk about posterior root, spinal nerve, and all that in lab more. If you don't understand it right now, what the heck I'm talking about, don't worry. We will in lab. Okay? All right, so look right here. This is a spinal nerve. Okay? So the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve, which means it carries both sensory and motor neurons. Okay? The motor neurons come off the front part of your spinal cord. This is called the anterior root, right? Or the ventral root. The sensory portion is on the back of the spinal cord. Okay? Same type of scenario. Remember, motor's in the front. Okay? The motor's in front of your car, motor's in the front of the spinal cord, sensory's in the back. The motor information leaves and exits out through the front. Sensory information enters in through the back. Okay? So where it comes in the back, all right, is called the posterior root, or also the dorsal root. Only sensory neurons are found here. Only motor neurons are found here. Right? Where we find both is in the spinal nerve. You guys got that? Okay, cool. I love it, Don. It make me happy. Okay. So, having said that, again, I will review this in lab. So if you feel lost, not to worry. When I first learned this stuff, I was pulling my hair out. That's why I don't have any hair on the front of my face. Okay. Normally by now I have a beard, by the way. Just thought I'd tell you guys that. Not because it's no shave November or whatever they call it. It's just that my beard is excessively white now and it shows me to look a lot older. So I'm trying to hide my age. All right. So crude touch, pressure, pain, temperature. All right. 3-neuron chain. Starting off with the primary neuron. Okay. Goes from the skin, our finger. Right. It is going to travel through the spinal nerve. It's going to go, since it's carrying sensory information, it's going to go into the back of the spinal cord through that posterior root. Right. And it is going to synapse with the secondary neuron in what we call the posterior horn. Okay? So the posterior horn is that gray area. Remember our goofy H here? My horribly drawn H? Okay? This region back here is called the posterior horn. It's all gray matter. This up here is called the anterior horn. Okay, and then I didn't draw it very well, but there's like a little blip that comes out here, and that's the lateral horn. Okay, so again, that spinal primary nerve comes in through the back. It's going to synapse onto, all right, this secondary neuron. Okay, so here comes that primary neuron. It enters in, and it synapses onto the secondary neuron here in the posterior horn. Now this is showing you, it's showing you 2 primary neurons, right? Because it's showing you both the anterior spinal thalamic tract and the lateral spinal thalamic tract. We're showing you, and that's why we call it the anterior lateral, right, pathway there. Okay. Back to here. All right. So secondary neuron. Okay. Again, this neuron is going to wind up going to none other than thalamus. So this secondary neuron travels from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Okay, but pay attention here. Right, we are going to see it decussate. You know what that means by now. Okay, it's going to decussate in the spinal cord. And when we talked about our last pathway, okay, the medial lemniscal pathway, it decussated up in the medulla. Okay, this one is going to decussate in the spinal cord. Okay, right here. Okay, so here it enters in on our left, okay, and it's going to cross over to the right. So it's going to, secondary neuron decussates and crosses over. And then it's going to ascend all the way up to the thalamus here, okay, where it's going to synapse onto the tertiary neuron, and we know the story there. What happens from the tertiary, where does the tertiary neuron go? The cerebral cortex, okay? That one's easy. I said easier. I think the tertiary neuron is probably the easiest one, right? Thalamus to the cortex. Easy enough, right? Okay. So what's going, now keep in mind, depending on what area, if it's my finger, it's going to go to a specific area of the, remember that sensory homunculus that we talked about, that goofy looking drawing of how your brain perceives your body, right? Depending on what area is being stimulated is going to determine where that tertiary neuron is going to go, okay? So we talk, that's why on the slide here it mentions the appropriate part of the primary somatosensory cortex, okay? It's carrying finger information. It's going to go to the finger information area of the primary somatosensory cortex there. Okay. Let's hit up the last one of our sensory pathways, and that is going to be the spinal cerebellar pathway. So now, if you dissect the title here, spinocerebellar, all right, so this pathway is going to head up to cerebellum, okay? So we talked about some of the brain work now, some of the functions of the cerebellum, right? And it is going to receive proprioceptive information, okay? And this pathway is only 2 neurons. This is really easy, okay? So the first neuron, again, is going to go from the skin up to the spinal cord, okay? And it's going to synapse on the secondary neuron. So that, we already know that story. Okay, so here you are. Okay, goes from the skin, right, enters into the posterior horn here, and it's going to synapse onto, right, the secondary neuron. Okay, now this picture is showing you, all right, there's 2 scenarios here. You can have an ipsilateral, right? You can see how it stays on the same side, okay? Or we can have a contralateral where it crosses over, okay? So keep that in mind, right? When we're dealing with the cerebellum, remember what I said, most of the pathways will decussate, they'll cross over. I didn't say all of them, okay? And usually the ones that go to the cerebellum, right, they don't always decussate, okay? So pretty much same thing as we saw before, the primary neuron. It goes from the skin to the spinal cord, synapses on the secondary neuron, right? Then that secondary neuron is going to ascend up to the cerebellum, okay? So we'll see, all right, that some of those secondary neurons will decussate or cross over. Some will remain ipsilateral, okay? And so there's 2 different pathways that they can ascend up through, all right? You have the anterior spinal cerebellar tract, and then the posterior spinal cerebellar tract. That's what we see here in our picture here. Okay, you have, right, the anterior and the posterior, depending on which region that it travels up through. Okay. All right, let's do the motor pathways. Any questions? Do this slide here? Yeah. All right. So I like the motor pathways because it's almost like everything in reverse. Okay, we're going to start up in the brain and then we're just going to go out to the periphery there. All right, now with motor pathways, it's a little bit different. We're going to do at least 2 neurons. For the most part, I don't know if you've ever heard of like an upper motor neuron lesion or a lower motor neuron lesion. An example of a lower motor neuron lesion is if I were to slice the sciatic nerve in my, I don't know why I did that to my hand. I would slice a sciatic nerve in my leg. What happens if you cut a nerve in your arm or your leg? Obviously it hurts, I get that. But if you were to cut it, what happens to the muscles? Yeah, well, you won't feel anything after that, but what happens to the muscles? Like if I were to cut the nerve that innervates these muscles, what happens to the muscles? It doesn't work. Paralysis. You get what's called flaccid paralysis. All right? So a lower motor neuron lesion results in flaccid paralysis. Okay? Upper motor neuron results in spastic paralysis. We'll talk more about that. All right? All right. So let's jump into the motor pathways here. Okay? So the nice thing about this is we're going to be discussing how it affects the effectors of skeletal muscles. We're going to deal with those two neurons that I was just talking to you about, upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. So these upper motor neurons, all right, there's a couple areas that they can originate from. Okay? Most of the time, they'll originate in the motor cortex. Okay? Then we're going to deal with the cerebral nucleus or a brainstem nucleus. Now, what does that all mean? All right? That's when we start to deal with cranial nerves. Okay? When we talk about the brainstem nucleus, that's usually in reference to the cranial nerves. Remember, for example, last week with you guys. We were talking about all the different cranial nerves, oculomotor, right, which controls some of the muscles of the eye, right? So that's what we're referring to when we're dealing with brainstem nucleus. And the upper motor neuron is going to synapse onto our lower motor neuron. And that lower motor neuron is then going to go out to skeletal muscle somewhere. It can be a cranial nerve, or it can go out to the spinal cord, okay, through the anterior horn. All right, if we're dealing with the cranial nerve, we're going to be talking about the cranial nerve nucleus. Whoops. If we're dealing with one of the muscles in your arms or your legs or your chest, torso, back, or whatever, then we're going to be referring to anterior horn. And we're always, always, always going to excite the muscle with the lower motor neuron. Okay? All right, let's talk about the direct pyramidal pathway. Okay? So this is, all right, one of the motor pathways that we're going to talk about that pretty much goes from the brain to the skeletal muscles. All right, so we're going to start off with the upper motor neuron, all right, and then we're going to finish up with the lower motor neuron. So in this situation, okay, I'm not going to mention this is not talking about cranial nerves or anything. I want to write a letter to somebody. Okay, so I'm going to use this pathway. Okay, so my upper motor neuron starts in the primary motor cortex, which is found where? What lobe? Make it easy on you. Where's the primary motor cortex found? And for you guys at home, feel free to typey. Primary motor cortex is found in your frontal lobe, specifically the precentral gyrus. Okay? All right. So, the upper motor neuron, right, is then going to travel down through the internal capsule is the white matter down in your cerebrum. It's going to travel down through that, and then I'm sure you guys remember this, cerebral peduncles. Does anyone remember where those were found? Midbrain, anterior portion of the midbrain. Okay, so it's going to travel down through the cerebral peduncles, and then, all right, it's going to, in the white matter, it's going to be referred to as the cortical spinal tracts. Okay, and it's going to travel all the way down into the spinal cord, right, to a specific level. Okay, and so usually it'll be, all right, into my cervical spine. Okay. And it's going to synapse on the lower motor neuron, which is found in the anterior horn. Well, what's the anterior horn? Great question. The anterior horn is this right here. Here and here. That's in the front. Okay? Then it's going to leave the anterior horn, meet up in the spinal. It's going to meet up and enter into the spinal nerve, and then go out to the muscle somewhere. That's my muscle. Okay. Okay. So, do I have a picture? Oh, wait, hold on. I'll come back. I'm not going to show you the picture yet. All right, so that's the direct pathway. Somewhat easy, right? You massaging your brain? I know, me too. All right, so again, we're starting off in the cerebral cortex, the primary motor cortex. We're going to go all the way down, right, into the spinal cord and synapse on the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is going to exit out of the spinal cord and synapse onto the skeletal muscle, therefore exciting it. Okay? So we have two types that we're going to discuss. You got your, our lateral cortical spinal tract and the anterior cortical spinal tracts. Okay? Very, very important that you know these two. Okay? All right, so when we're talking about the lateral cortical spinal tracts, because remember, we're talking about skeletal muscles. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. So those fibers need to cross over. Okay, so with the lateral cortical spinal tract, we're going to see that decussation occur in the medulla oblongata pyramids there. Okay, those pyramids were those two bumps that we saw in the front of the medulla oblongata. Okay. And then what will happen is, right, the upper motor neuron will travel down in the lateral funiculi. What is the lateral funiculi? All right, this was the posterior funiculi. This is the lateral funiculi, here and here. Okay, this is supposed to be the spinal cord, by the way. I know it's a horrible drawing. I apologize. Correct. Yes, yes, yes. The first slide was just an overview, and this is getting just more specific. Okay. All right, so when we're talking about the lateral, we'll decussate in the medulla's pyramids there. Important that you know that. All right. So then again, it will synapse with the lower motor neuron in the anterior horn. Okay, right here, and then it will go out in the spinal nerve. Okay, but this is important. I'm going to erase all that scribbling there. All right, this is going to innervate your limb muscles. Okay, lateral cortical spinal tract is going to innervate the limb muscles. You need to know the difference between the lateral and the anterior. Because the anterior is going to innervate the axial muscle. Hey, axial skeletal muscles, appendicular skeletal muscles. See, there you go. All right. So an easy way to remember that is lateral starts with L, limb starts with L. Okay, anterior starts with A, axial starts with A. That helps you? Cool. Okay. All right, so quickly just with the anterior cortical spinal tract, and then I'll go over the drawings here for the cortical spinal tracts, and then we'll take a break. All right. So in the anterior, okay, the upper motor neuron, right, is going to travel all the way down without crossing. It has not crossed yet. It hasn't decussated yet. Right? And it's going to travel all the way down into the anterior funiculi. Okay, remember, anterior funiculi is on the front part of our spinal cord. The drawings got worse. I'm rushing it. All right, that's the anterior funiculi. Okay? So now in the spinal cord, that's where we're going to see the decussation occurring. Okay? And then it's going to synapse, right, either on an inner neuron, because in some situations we will deal with more than one, with more than a two neuron chain here, right, or a lower motor neuron. Okay, but it's going to innervate the axial skeletal muscles. Point of fact, right? This is all going to be, right, somatic neurons. You have conscious, or excuse me, you have voluntary control over this because it's skeletal muscles. Okay, so when you are drawing, walking, running, whatever, you are utilizing these motor pathways. All right, so quickly, let me just show you cortical spinal here. All right, so here is, all right, your primary motor cortex. Okay, so that's where we're going to find our upper motor neuron. Okay, so it's going to travel. This is the internal capsule here. That's that white matter here in the cerebrum. It's going to travel all the way down here. Okay, it's going to go through. Right, this is the midbrain here. Okay, it's going to travel through the cerebral peduncles. When we were labeling the midbrain there last class, these were going to be, all right, descending, all right, motor neurons, somatic motor neurons. Okay? So what will happen is they'll travel down, all right. Now the lateral cortical spinal decussates or crosses over in the pyramids here. Okay, it crosses over in the medulla oblongata. Then it descends down into the spinal cord, and it's going to wind up in the lateral funiculus over here. Okay? And it'll synapse onto either an interneuron or directly onto the lower motor neuron. And that lower motor neuron exits out of the anterior horn. This is the anterior root. And then it enters into the spinal nerve and then out to the skeletal muscle. Okay? So that's the lateral, all right, cortical spinal tract, and that crosses over in the medulla oblongata, in the pyramids here. All right, our anterior, same scenario, is going to start off here, all right, in the primary motor cortex, right, descends down, travels into the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain, does not cross over, it stays ipsilateral, right. It'll travel down through the anterior cortical spinal tract. That's going to be found, or in the medulla oblongata. That's going to be found in the pyramids here. These two little ridges or bumps, those are the pyramids. It's going to stay ipsilateral, and then it's going to cross over, right? It's going to cross over, decussate, right, onto either an interneuron or the lower motor neuron. Okay, but it's going to decussate in the anterior funiculus. That's all this white matter in the front. Right. And then it will synapse onto the interneuron or directly onto the lower motor neuron. Then that lower motor neuron then will exit the spinal cord out through the anterior root there into the spinal nerve and then synapse onto the skeletal muscle. Thank you, Mommy. I'm full. Please be excused. Brains look full. A lot of information. I'm proud of you folks. All right.